They were promised salvation, but they never returned. 72 children gathered beneath candlelight for a feast of the soul. The doors were locked, the bells tolled, and the meal became a ritual. No bodies were ever found, only plates, arranged as if waiting for them still. To this day, the Mass is not ended. The camera drifts slowly over a roof of broken tiles. Rain gathers in shallow pools. The walls below sag inward. Stone once white, now blackened with soot. And behind those walls, 72 children waited for a promise. The year was 1897. The village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Mer was small, pressed between the sea and the forest. It clung to the edges of Europe's industrial century, untouched by wealth, untouched by progress. Its people survived on fishing, on salt, on prayer. At the highest point of the town stood the orphanage, a block of stone the color of ash. Built in the late 1700s, it had been a Carmelite convent, then a poorhouse, and finally, by decree of the diocese, a shelter for the unwanted. The locals called it La Maison Blanche, but its walls were never white. Children rarely left it. Some grew into apprentices or were sent to farms, but most remained within until they were old enough to vanish quietly into the cities. Few remembered their names. Few wanted to. The sisters who ran it were known only by number. Sister 1, Sister 2, Sister 3. Their vows required silence beyond prayer. They were shadows moving across the stone corridors. They wore habits with veils that concealed the face. Some villagers whispered they did not eat in public. Others whispered they had no faces at all. And then, one spring morning, a letter arrived. It was carried by a boy in rags, who knocked on the door of the town's lone baker. He handed over a folded sheet sealed with red wax. The mark was not of the bishop. It was not of any parish known to the region. Instead, it bore a simple symbol, a chalice carved in a single line. The baker read the letter aloud, and those who heard it said the words seemed rehearsed. It was an invitation. A holy feast would be held at the orphanage, a feast for the children, a feast of salvation. Every orphan, all 72, would gather in the great hall. They would be dressed in white. They would be fed not just with bread and wine, but with grace. The townspeople listened. Some smiled. It was Easter season, and a feast for children seemed harmless. Others shifted uneasily. The orphanage had never before opened its doors for celebration. And yet, the bells began to ring. That evening, iron bells long silent tolled above the orphanage. First once, then twice, then a third time. By the seventh toll, villagers had gathered in the square. They looked up to see banners unfurling from the orphanage windows. White cloth billowing in the sea wind. Some said the cloth shone too bright in the dusk, as if it were not fabric at all, but something bleached, bone, or ash, or salt. Children could be heard singing. Thin voices, rising in unison. They sang a hymn no one recognized. Not Latin, not French. Something older or something newer. But it carried across the square, clear as if whispered directly into each ear. The priest of St. Pierre, Father Duret, stood at the steps of the chapel. He was a man nearing 60, with a crooked spine and trembling hands. He rarely spoke without stammering. Yet that night he raised his voice without hesitation. "The children will be saved," he said. "The Lord has prepared a table for them." And then he smiled, a wide, unnatural smile. Some villagers later said they had never seen his teeth before that night. But something wasn't right. The next day, mothers came to the gates of the orphanage. They brought gifts, small loaves of bread, dried apples, tiny crosses carved from driftwood. They hoped their offerings would be added to the feast. But the gates were shut. A young novice in gray robes told them gently, "No gifts are needed. The table is already set." From that moment, rumors spread. One man swore he saw a cart delivered in the dead of night, wooden, covered with canvas. Its wheels left deep grooves in the mud outside the orphanage. But no driver was seen and the horse left no tracks. Another villager told of a smell, sweet metallic, drifting down the hill, like wine spilled on stone, like rust left in the sun. Still, the announcement remained. At the end of the week, a holy feast. 72 children and the promise of salvation. The day arrived heavy with rain. Dark clouds pressed low, smothering the sea horizon. The town was drowned in mist. Fishermen did not take their boats out that morning. Instead, they gathered in silence near the chapel, watching the path that climbed toward the orphanage. One by one, the children appeared, not wandering down, not escorted, but arranged in a slow, solemn procession. Each child wore a robe of plain white, tied at the waist with a strip of red cloth. Their feet were bare. Their hair had been shorn. Their faces were blank, neither smiling nor weeping. The sisters walked behind them, black veils rippling in the wind. Their steps did not falter on the wet stones. Their hands were hidden inside their sleeves. A few villagers tried to call out to the children. A wave, a smile, but not one child turned their head. They moved like sleepwalkers. As the procession reached the orphanage gates, the bells rang again, not the deep toll of iron, but a thin, high chime, like glass struck with metal. It echoed across the town, sharp enough to sting the ear. Inside, the doors closed, and the singing began once more. The hymn rose through the rain, 72 voices layered one over the other. It was not melody. It was not harmony. It was a wall of sound, flat, continuous, endless. Some villagers covered their ears. Others wept. One fisherman muttered under his breath, "This is not for us." That night, lights burned in the windows. Dozens of candles, their flames quivering against the mist. Shadows flickered across the walls. Children seated, heads bowed, hands folded, but the shadows stretched too long, as if each child was taller than their body allowed, as if something behind them was casting a second figure. The townspeople returned to their homes, shaken but silent. They told themselves it was nothing, that it was charity, that the church was simply caring for its forgotten. But in the quiet of their beds, many dreamed of long tables stretching into the dark, tables lined with plates, tables where the chairs were filled, yet the faces could not be seen. And in every dream, there was a chalice at the center, a chalice without a bottom. The feast had been announced, and there would be no return. The camera drifts inward, across a stone corridor, walls sweating with damp, the echo of footsteps that no one is making. And at the end of the passage, a hall lit only by candlelight. There were 72 of them, children taken from the village, or left at the gates by mothers who could not provide. Some remembered scraps of family. Most remembered nothing at all. On the night of the feast, they were gathered here. Every witness, every survivor who dared to speak later, said the same thing. The children were dressed alike. White robes, tied at the waist with strips of red cloth. Their heads bowed, their hands folded neatly in their laps. The smell of tallow and smoke pressed heavy against the walls. Candles filled the space, not in chandeliers, not in holders, but set directly on the floor in clusters, pools of wax spreading like rivers of pale blood. The flames trembled whenever a child breathed, and the walls were lined with paintings, not the kind one finds in churches, not familiar saints, not angels, not Christ triumphant. Each wall bore a different rendition of the Last Supper, 12 disciples, one Christ, a single table, but something wasn't right. The faces were wrong. The brushstrokes blurred the eyes, mouths stretched too wide, too long, so that each figure appeared both smiling and weeping at once. One villager who peeked through the windows swore he saw teeth where none should be, dozens of teeth jagged, painted with an almost obsessive care. Another witness later said that Judas's face appeared on all 12 disciples, that no matter where she looked, the betrayer stared back. The hall smelled of oil paint and wax, a cloying sweetness, too strong for air. The children were silent. 72, seated in perfect rows, facing the long table at the center. No food had been laid yet, only plates, plain white ceramic, a gobble before each child. The goblets were empty, and yet some children licked their lips. One survivor, an older boy who fled before the night was over, claimed that the silence was worse than any hymn. He remembered the sound of 72 robes shifting as the children adjusted their seats. He remembered the sound of breathing, drawn in together, exhaled together like the swell of a tide. He said it felt rehearsed, as though they had been practicing for weeks. And that's when he noticed. No one blinked. The sisters moved between them, heads bowed, veils shrouding their faces. Their hands glided across the table, straightening plates, adjusting goblets. Not once did they speak. At the head of the hall stood Father Durrett. He leaned on his cane, stooped, the tremor in his hand more visible than ever, but his voice was clear, clearer than the boy had ever heard. "They are ready," he said. The candles flickered at once, as if pulled by a breath. "They are ready to receive." One villager later described the sound of the bell at that moment. Not the great bell of the tower, but a small one, handheld, chiming with a pitch that lodged in the ear. The children raised their heads together, 72 sets of eyes catching the candlelight. And in that moment, something shifted. The boy who fled said it was the faces. For just a second, in the wavering light, their features seemed altered, shadows carving the cheeks. Eyes too hollow, smiles too sharp. He said it was the paintings. That each time the flame bent, the faces on the wall moved with it. That Judas blinked. That Judas leaned closer. No one else dared to look. The children did not speak. The sisters did not whisper. Only the priest's voice filled the room. "This," he said, "is a feast." And he raised his hand over the plates, as if to bless them. But there was nothing on the plates, nothing in the goblets. And yet, the boy swore he saw the children's mouths move, quiet, hidden behind lowered chins, tongues tracing their lips, teeth grinding. He swore he heard it, the sound of chewing. No food, no drink, only chewing. The boy pressed his fist to his ears, but the sound grew louder. Not a single bite, not a single swallow, but 72 mouths working in rhythm. And when he looked again, the candles were burning lower, the wax spilling faster. The shadows stretched higher up the walls, until the faces in the paintings were almost lost in the dark. He could not stand it. He rose from his seat, trembling, shaking. The sister nearest him turned her veiled head, slowly, deliberately, and though he could not see her eyes, he knew she was watching. He ran. He slipped between two chairs. His robe caught on the wood, tearing at the hem. He did not stop to look back. Through the corridor, down the stairs, toward the side door left unlatched. Behind him, the chewing never faltered. The boy remembered the last thing he saw before he escaped. The priest at the head of the hall, his hands lifted higher now, his smile wider, and the faces on the wall, all turning toward him. The boy ran into the night, and the feast began without him. The frame lingers on the iron gate. Rust streaks down its bars. Rain gathers in the mud below, and beyond the gate, the doors of the orphanage, thick wood, reinforced with iron bands, shut against the night. When the feast began, no one outside was allowed to enter. Villagers had gathered on the slope below, curious, uneasy. They had seen the children vanish inside, 72 in white robes, and had expected at least a sound of laughter or of plates being served. But instead, they saw the doors drawn shut, the sound of heavy bolts sliding into place. It was not subtle. The scrape of metal carried down the hill, one after another, locked from within, and the people waiting outside began to shift. They whispered to one another. Was it custom? Was it ceremony? Had the priest demanded silence of the meal? But something wasn't right. There were no torches left burning at the gate, no novices moving in or out. The steps remained empty. The building itself seemed to retreat behind its own walls. And then came the sound, at first faint, barely audible, a single note drawn out like a thread pulled through cloth, and then a second and a third, until it became unmistakable. Children's voices. They were singing, a low chant, rising together, drifting through the cracks of shuttered windows. The sound moved strangely, sometimes muffled, as though coming from deep underground, other times piercing, as though whispered directly into the listener's ear. The people below could not make out the words. They did not recognize the melody, but they all agreed later. It did not sound like children at all. One fisherman said it reminded him of the sea, the way waves pull and crash, the way currents drag you down, whether you fight or not. Another villager swore it was like bees in a hive, thousands of wings beating in unison, vibrating against the skull. And yet others said it was simply prayer. Prayer stretched too long, prayer spoken without breath. The sound filled the air. The villagers grew restless. A few tried the gate. They pushed against the iron, rattled the lock. The chains held firm. One man swore he saw movement behind the windows, shapes crossing back and forth in the candlelight. But when he called out, no one answered. A woman tried to approach the door directly. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening. Her face paled. She stepped back without a word. Later, when pressed, she said she had heard nothing at all. No chanting, no voices, only silence so deep it left her trembling. And that's when he heard it. An old man, standing apart from the others, swore he caught the distinct sound of weeping, not from within the hall, but from just behind the door. Small, stifled sobs, the kind a child makes when they are afraid to be heard. He shouted. He demanded the doors be opened. His cries echoed into the night, but no answer came. The bolts remained sealed. The chanting continued. It rose in waves, falling to a whisper, then swelling into something almost unbearable. The air itself seemed to hum with the vibration. Several villagers clutched their heads. A few turned away, walking back into town, refusing to linger any longer. But others stayed. They wanted to know what was happening to the children. One young man tried the side path, circling toward the orphanage gardens. He hoped to find a back entrance left unguarded. He returned minutes later, shaken, saying every door, every window, every gate was locked tight. Even the cellar doors, once left open to vent the kitchens, had been sealed with boards. Inside, the children sang louder. Some swore they could hear the words now. Simple phrases, repeated, but none could agree on what language it was. One insisted it was Latin, another, Old French. A third claimed it was neither, that it was closer to the sound of birds at dawn, shrill and inhuman. The longer they listened, the more each person seemed to hear something different. One villager crossed herself and whispered, "They are not singing, they are being sung through." And the others fell silent. The night pressed on. Rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the shutters. The villagers huddled beneath cloaks, but still they lingered, staring up at the building. Every window glowed with candlelight, but the flames did not flicker, not once, as though the air inside were utterly still. A boy from the town, no older than 12, slipped free from his mother's grasp. He darted forward, running up the steps toward the main door. His fists pounded against the wood. He called the name of a girl he knew, an orphan of the same age, with whom he had played in the fields years before. The chanting never faltered. No one answered. The boy was pulled back. His mother clutched him to her chest, scolding through her tears. By then, unease had curdled into fear. The people outside understood they would not be allowed in, that something had begun behind those doors, and it was not for them. But they also understood something else. The children were not coming back out. The chanting reached its peak just before midnight. 72 voices rising together until the sound was no longer distinct notes, but a wall of vibration that rattled windows and teeth. And then, as the church bell struck 12, the sound cut off. Silence fell so suddenly that the villagers gasped aloud. The only noise was the rain, hissing against the stones. The doors remained sealed, and no one dared to knock again. The camera drifts downward over a long wooden table. Plates waiting, goblets waiting, 72 children sitting in silence, and the meal about to begin. Inside the hall, the air was dense with wax and oil. Candles hissed in their own melted rivers, dripping against the stone floor. Shadows pulsed faintly on the walls. The paintings of the Last Supper loomed larger now, their warped faces catching the flicker of every flame. The first dish was bread. Baskets were carried forward by the veiled sisters. They moved without speaking, their steps measured, their arms bent as though carrying something heavier than loaves of bread. The bread was plain, round, pale, divided into hunks. Yet those who saw it remembered the smell. Yeast left too long, dough baked too hard, almost bitter. Each child was given a piece, placed carefully on the plate before them, and they did not touch it, not at first. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hiss of dripping wax, until the priest raised his hand. "Eat," he said. The word was soft, but the children obeyed at once. 72 pairs of hands lifted bread to mouths. 72 mouths began to chew. The sound was faint at first, crumbs grinding, teeth working. But in the hush of the hall, it carried. Every bite echoed against the stone until it became a single, grinding rhythm. The boy who had escaped remembered that rhythm. He said it was not hunger, it was obedience. The way soldiers march, step after step, without question. But something wasn't right. The children chewed too long. They chewed even after the bread was gone, their jaws working, their throats swallowing air. And then the wine was brought out. It was not served in pitchers, not poured from jugs. Instead, the sisters carried a single, wide-bellied chalice. Heavy, dark metal, not silver, not gold. Its surface dulled as though kept from the light. They walked it slowly down the length of the table. The priest dipped a ladle, poured into each goblet. One by one, the liquid was red, too red. It stained the rims of the cups, staining the lips of the goblets the way rust stains iron. The smell was strong, stronger than ordinary wine, metallic, sharp. The children raised their cups together. No one spoke. They drank. The sound was almost delicate. 72 sips, 72 swallows. And that's when he heard it. The survivor said the voices began to change. First soft, then clearer, as if something were loosening inside them. A hymn rose up, but the tones faltered uneven. The words sounded broken, not quite their own, as though the voices were being pulled from them, forced into the air, leaving emptiness behind. A nun whispered under her breath. She leaned to another, thinking no one would hear. They are being emptied. But the boy at the table heard. He never forgot. The faces around him began to shift. The glassiness of the eyes was a first sign, pupils dilating, then freezing. Children staring straight ahead, not seeing, not blinking. Their lips parted as they sang, but the sound seemed attached, as though another mouth were using them. Their voices layered. At first it was like a choir. Then it became something else. 72 voices, but without breath. Words emerging too long, too steady, too heavy for lungs that small. The boy turned, looking desperately for recognition, for another child who still seemed alive. But every face was slack, every mouth opened, trembling with song, every eye fixed on the void ahead. And in that moment, he realized he was the only one still chewing. The bread in his mouth, the taste bitter, clinging to his tongue. The goblet before him filled to the rim, the smell cutting into his throat. He could not drink. He lowered his eyes, trembling. The sisters passed by, their veils shifting, their hands clasped. None stopped. None spoke. Only the priest's voice broke the air. "Now they are ready," he said. The candles shook. The walls seemed to pull closer. The boy swore the paintings had changed again. Faces drawn longer, eyes sunk deeper, mouths wider. Every disciple now staring directly at the children, every one of them smiling. The hymn grew louder. 72 voices climbing, cracking, trembling as if stretched beyond flesh. The boy covered his ears. It didn't help. The sound was inside his chest now, pressing against his ribs, filling the hollow behind his heart. The goblet before him trembled. The liquid inside did not ripple. It held perfectly still, reflecting his face. And the reflection did not look back the same. He closed his eyes. He did not drink. And still, around him, the feast went on. Children singing, voices hollow. Bread gone. Wine drained. Their eyes turned glassy. Their mouths still moving, as if the meal had not filled them, but taken them away. The camera drifts upward through a dark sky, clouds rolling low, heavy, smothering the stars. And beneath them, the town lies silent. Stone cottages pressed close to one another. Narrow streets empty. Only the faint glow of oil lamps seeping through shuttered windows. It was a night like any other, until the first bell rang. The sound was deep, slow, carrying across the fields, through the alleys, against the walls of every home. One strike, then another. The people of the town woke at once. It was midnight. The bells should not have been ringing. Neighbors pushed open windows, leaning out into the cold air. Some stepped into the street, lanterns in hand, their faces pale with sleep. The bells kept tolling. The sound rolled through the ground, rattling the shutters, humming through the beams of the roofs. Children began to cry. Dogs barked, straining against their chains. But no one moved toward the church. Not yet, because something wasn't right. The bell should only have rung 12 times. A sign of midnight, a keeping of hours. But the count went on. 13, 14, 15. Each strike slower than the last, echoing long into the silence between. The sound reached even the farthest farms on the hill. Families stirred awake. Men dressed quickly, pulling boots over bare feet, clutching lanterns. They stepped into the night, scanning the horizon where the church stood above the town. Its tower was dark, no glow from within, only the outline black against the swollen clouds. And yet the bells rang. By the 20th toll, people had gathered in the square, dozens and more, each one counting under their breath. 21, 22, 23. The crowd shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, whispering. Some prayed softly, words slipping like breath into the cold. The ropes of the bell tower were long, heavy. Every villager knew the effort it took to pull them. The priest would stand braced, straining with both hands, body lifted by the weight. No single man could keep it going for long. And yet the strikes continued. The rhythm never faltered. 35, 36, faces tilted upward, eyes fixed on the tower, waiting to see movement in the windows above, waiting for the flicker of a lantern. There was nothing. The windows gaped empty. Black stone, dark air, and still the bells rang. A woman clutched her shawl tightly against her chest. Her lips moved silently, mouthing each number. By 40, her voice cracked. She closed her eyes. No one spoke aloud what they were all beginning to fear, that the bells were tolling themselves. The boy who survived would later say the air grew thicker with each strike. He remembered pressing his palms to his ears, but the sound was inside him, rattling his bones, sinking deep into his stomach. By the 50th toll, men had begun to argue. Some said it was a mistake. A hand slipped. The priest drunk. Others swore it was no man's doing, that the church was warning them, or cursing them. The voices grew louder, clashing in the square, but all were drowned by the weight of the bell. 58, 59, 60, and then silence. The crowd froze. The sudden absence was heavier than the sound itself. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. But then it came again. 61, 62. The final count pushed them past fear into disbelief. 71, 72, and then nothing. No echo, no wind, no sound of night creatures stirring in the hedges. Only stillness. The people stood locked in place, lanterns trembling in their hands. Some turned toward one another, asking without words what it meant. But others could not look away from the tower. One man swore he saw a movement, a flicker in the darkness, as though something had shifted just inside the window. He shouted, pointing upward. The crowd followed his finger, straining their eyes. But the window was empty, the tower still, the ropes untouched. And yet the sound of the bells seemed to hang in the air, as if the night itself had kept its memory. The boy remembered the faces of the villagers, pale, open-mouthed, staring at the tower as though waiting for it to fall. And he remembered the silence that followed. No one went inside the church that night. Not a priest, not a nun, not a single villager. The doors remained closed. The square emptied slowly, step by step, until only the lamps burned against the stones. But the fear stayed. It would not leave, because everyone had counted the same. 72 tolls. Not one less, not one more. And no one had been seen in the tower. The boy would later whisper to himself, as if trying to believe it. The bells had rung for every child inside, one toll for each. The frame lingers on the old church wall, its stone damp with years of rain, ivy pulling at its cracks. The camera moves slowly, tracing the edge of a narrow wooden door, set deep into the masonry. It is barely wide enough for a child to slip through. Most villagers had forgotten it even existed, but it was through this door that the boy escaped. The night of the bells, while the town stood staring at the tower, the boy had been inside. He would never explain how he found the door or why it was unlatched, only that the air in the dormitory had grown unbearable. That something in the silence pressed too hard against his chest. He slipped out barefoot, the grass wet beneath his feet, his breathing sharp. Behind him, the church loomed, swollen with sound and shadow. He ran until the fields opened before him, until the bell fell silent. And in the days that followed, he became the only one, the only witness, the only child ever seen outside those walls again. At first, the town sheltered him. They gave him bread, warm milk, a place to sleep. The women touched his hair gently as he passed, whispering prayers under their breath. He was, to them, both fragile and sacred, a living remnant of what had been taken. But something wasn't right. The boy would not eat at the table. He refused chairs. Whenever food was set before him, he crouched on the floor, knees tucked to his chest, glancing beneath the table as though expecting something to move. The men asked him what he was looking for. His eyes would shift quickly, but he never answered, until one night he whispered it. Hands. He said there were hands beneath the table. Not his own, not anyone's. Just hands, moving in the dark space between legs and chairs, brushing against the wood, grasping at ankles. He said he felt them. Some laughed nervously. Others hushed him, telling him it was a dream. But the boy's face did not change. He was certain. The townsfolk grew unsettled. Whispers spread that he had seen too much inside the church, that the bells had shaken something loose in him. And then came the other thing, the second mouth. He spoke of it in fragments, quietly, when he thought no one was listening. During prayer, he said he had seen lips moving where there should have been none, not on faces, not where word belonged. A second mouth, he called it, opening in prayer. No one pressed him for more. They were afraid of what he might say. The boy became restless. He would not stay in one house for long. He drifted between families, sleeping a night here, 2 nights there, always moving, always glancing behind him. Some said he would sit awake in the dark, staring at the corners of the room, as though listening for something others could not hear. The weeks passed, and then he was gone. One morning, the bed was empty, the blanket folded neatly, as though he had prepared himself to leave. No tracks in the dirt, no sound of departure, just absence. The villagers searched the fields, the river, the woods that bordered the parish. They called his name until their voices cracked, but there was no answer. The boy had vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. And yet, some claimed they saw him, not in daylight, not close enough to touch, but at the edge of the square, by the church wall, near the same door he had once slipped through, a shadow too small to be a man, standing perfectly still, and then gone again before anyone could reach him. The story spread quickly. His words lingered longer than his presence. Mothers hushed their children at night, warning them not to sit under tables too long, not to stare too closely at mouths in prayer. Because what if he was right? What if he had seen something the rest of them were never meant to see? And what if it had followed him? The final account came from an old woman who swore she heard him singing. Not a hymn she recognized, not a tune from the parish. It was low, slow, a broken rhythm, like someone learning to speak again. She listened from her window, too afraid to rise, the sound moving through the night like a current. And then it stopped. That was the last anyone heard of him. No grave, no return, only a memory. And a warning left half-finished, like a prayer caught in the throat. The boy had escaped once. But escape, it seemed, was never meant to last. The camera drifts across a gray morning sky. Mist gathers at the base of the church wall, softening the stones, hiding the cracks. The doors stand shut, the bell tower silent. And yet, inside, something lingers. It was weeks before the diocese acted. Whispers had reached them from the town. Stories of silence, of absence. Stories that would not resolve themselves. And so a small delegation was formed. 3 priests, a notary, and 2 attendants, sent to observe, to record. They arrived in the first light of day. Horses steaming, breath visible in the cold. The square was empty. The villagers kept to their doors, watching from behind shutters, too afraid to come near. The priests dismounted carefully, their boots echoing across the flagstones. It was quiet, too quiet. The air lacked the movement of life. No chatter, no footsteps, no children darting between shadows. Only the steady creak of the church's timbers, shifting in the morning frost. The men exchanged looks but said nothing. They entered. The door resisted at first, swollen from the damp, but yielded to the shoulder of the eldest priest. The wood groaned and the smell rushed out. It was not decay. Not yet. It was warm. The scent of tallow, wax, faintly of bread. The air carried the weight of a room that had been used, lived in. They stepped inside and froze. Every plate was in its place, rows upon rows of them, spread neatly across the refectory tables, each plate clean, polished to a sheen. Not a scrap of food, not a single crumb. The cups, too, turned down, drained to the last drop, as though the meal had only just been finished. And yet there was no one, no sisters, no children. The benches were empty, but not cold. When one of the priests laid a hand against the wood, he drew it back in shock. The seat still held warmth, as if a body had only just risen from it. But the room was silent, and the silence pressed against them. The notary began his work. He opened his ledger, dipped the quill. The scratching of the nib was too loud, echoing back at them. He wrote that the plates were spotless, that the cups were drained, that the bread was gone, that the warmth was still present. But he did not write how his hand trembled. The priests moved deeper into the building. The dormitories were the same. Beds made, sheets smoothed, small shoes lined at the foot of each frame. A doll placed carefully on a pillow. But no children. Only the faint hollow in the mattress where a body had lain. Still warm. The attendants refused to touch them. They lingered in the doorway, clutching their rosaries, whispering to each other when the priests' backs were turned. The chapel was the last to be opened. The candles had burned low, leaving wax puddled along the brass. The altar cloth was pressed, unstained. The pews perfectly aligned. But here, too, the seats retained their heat. The priests stood in the aisle, feeling the weight of absence pressing in on them. Something wasn't right. The silence was not natural. It felt held, as though the walls themselves were listening. The eldest priest knelt to pray. His voice quavered in the emptiness, but it steadied as if familiar words came. The others bowed their heads. And then he stopped, his prayer cut short. When he looked up, his face had changed. He said he felt breath on the back of his neck. But when the attendants turned, there was nothing, only the air, still warm. The investigation ended quickly after that. The notary closed his book. The men withdrew. No one dared touch the plates, or the cups, or the beds. No one dared disturb what had been so carefully left. They sealed the church again, bolted the doors. The report was carried back to the diocese, written in neat hand, formal, cautious, detached. But among the priests themselves, another version spread. They spoke of the heat in the wood, the impression of bodies that were not there, of the way the air seemed to move without wind, and of the feeling, impossible to name, that someone had just stepped out of the room, just one breath before, but had left no trace of where they'd gone. In time, their words leaked beyond the diocese. Villagers spoke of the warmth as though it were a kind of haunting, as though the bodies themselves had dissolved into the walls. Parents told their children never to touch a chair left empty, never to sit in a place that still carried warmth, because warmth, they said, meant was not truly empty. And that was where the priests left it, a report, a sealed door, and a silence that did not lift. But something lingered, something no document could contain. When the priests returned to their homes, some swore they carried the warmth with them, that they would sit in their own chambers at night, only to feel the cushion dip beside them, as though someone else had taken a seat, as though someone had followed. They told no one, but their silence spoke louder than any record. The diocese closed the matter, but in the town, the fear remained, because the priests had reported what they saw, and what they saw was impossible to forget. Plates emptied, cups drained, beds warm, but no one left to claim them. No one at all, and the warmth never truly faded. The camera drifts slowly across stone, walls blackened by damp, a silence heavier than time itself. The village streets around the parish were already empty by then, shutters drawn, doors barred. Those who remained no longer spoke in the open. They crossed themselves when walking past the chapel. And when asked what happened there, they lowered their voices to whispers. But the men in Rome had their answer prepared. They called it plague, a sudden fever, a sickness of the blood, a disease that swept through the parish and left nothing but absence in its wake. On paper, the explanation was clean, simple, contained, but something wasn't right. No physicians had been summoned. No death carts had rolled through the narrow lanes. No graves had been dug. No bells tolled for the departed. There were no records of funerals, no certificates of death. And yet, all were gone. The orders came swiftly. Reports sealed. Diaries confiscated. The diocese instructed not to speak of it again. Those who questioned were told to remain obedient. Those who pressed further were removed. Behind closed doors, parishioners murmured another story. That Rome was not erasing disease. It was silencing something older than the parish, older than the village, older, perhaps, than the church itself. In the taverns, men told of the nights before the disappearance, the bells that rang without hands, the boy who muttered about a second mouth opening in prayer, the priest who had entered and never returned. And though the officials declared it tragedy, survivors remembered differently. One woman spoke of the pews. She said when she slipped inside days after, the air was still warm. The wooden seats pressed with a faint indentation of bodies, as though they had only just risen. And that's when she heard it. A sigh, barely audible, not from her, not from the wind, from beneath the altar. She fled before she could look. Her statement never appeared in the archives. Another man confessed in his final years that he had seen the letters sent from parish priests to Rome in the weeks before the silence. Pleas for guidance. Pleas that went unanswered. He remembered one line most of all. They are praying without words. But the church did not preserve those letters. They burned them. The explanation never shifted. Rome repeated it year after year. A tragedy of pestilence. A parish undone by contagion. And the village, stripped of its memory, learned to carry silence. But silence can rot. It spreads through families, through generations, through stone. And when the young asked what had happened, the old did not answer. They only warned. Never step inside the chapel. Never stay past midnight. And never ask the priests of Rome, because some said Rome already knew. They knew what the parish had uncovered. They knew what the bells had called down. And they knew it was older than doctrine, older than prayer, older than them. The officials closed their books, but the parishioners kept their whispers, and it was those whispers that survived. Even now, they say if you stand by the chapel doors after dusk, you'll feel it, the faint warmth, the breath of a congregation still seated in their pews, waiting for the silence to break, waiting for the bells to ring again. And when they do, Rome will not deny it. Not this time. The frame holds still on stone. A long corridor of weathered walls. Cracks spread like veins through plaster. And yet, even in its ruin, there is a weight here. The faint impression of a place that once held order. Ritual. Repetition. The parish hall had been empty for decades. Doors chained shut. Windows boarded. Locals avoided the square after dark. They knew what happened there. Because every year on the same night, something returned. It began with light. A faint glow behind the slats of wood. Flickering. Shifting. Candlelight. Villagers would pause at their shutters. Some swore they heard voices. The low murmur of conversation. The rhythm of laughter. But something wasn't right. Inside the hall, there should have been nothing. No oil to burn. No candles left behind. No hands to strike the match. And yet the glow persisted. Always in the same pattern. Always in the same order. One witness, an old farmer, described what he saw through a crack in the shutters. He said the table stretched end to end, laid with plates. 72 of them. Not one more. Not one less. He said the silver caught the light as though freshly polished. The goblets filled themselves with wine, and the air shimmered with warmth, though the night outside was cold. He never returned to the window after that. Others were less cautious. Young men dared each other to press their ears against the walls. They told of the sound of knives against porcelain, forks scraping bone, bread breaking, liquid poured from high above into glass. But there was something wrong in the rhythm. The laughter was close, but hollow. The voices repeated as though caught in a loop. The same words spoken twice. The same cheer raised again. And then silence. One boy who listened said he heard his own name called from inside. He never approached the hall again. And that's when he heard it. A chair sliding back. The floorboards groaning under sudden weight. Footsteps moving toward the door. But when he ran, when he looked back, the hall stood still. Dark, silent, and the glow was gone. Those who counted the plates said the number never changed. 72. The exact number of souls said to have vanished from the parish that night. The sisters, the children, the priests, and the table always laid for them. A villager who had lost her sister swore she recognized her voice among the laughter. She stayed by the wall for nearly an hour, straining to hear more, but she left in tears. Because though the voices carried joy, none of them spoke of leaving. It was a feast with no end, a repetition of something that had already happened, or perhaps something that had never ended at all. In the records of the diocese, no mention of these sightings exists. Officially, the hall remains abandoned, a building without use. But the villagers do not need records. They have memory, they have stories, and they know the glow will return again. They speak of how the air changes when the night approaches. The square feels colder. Animals refuse to pass. Even dogs lower their heads and whine. And as midnight falls, the first flicker begins. A single candle, then another, until the whole length of the table burns with light. Some say they have tried to interrupt it. One man forced the doors open years ago before the feast began. He said he found nothing. But when he returned to the square, moments later, the glow had already begun. Others attempted to seal the hall with stone. But within months, the walls cracked. The glow slipped through the fissures. It cannot be contained. It cannot be stopped. Only witnessed. And those who witness too closely do not speak of it again. Some move away, some fall silent, and a few are never seen at all. But always, the villagers count. Always, the number returns to 72. Never more, never less. And when asked why they never try again to break the ritual, the elders answer quietly, because they fear the feast is not merely repeating. It is waiting for one more plate to be added, for one more chair to be drawn, for one more voice to join the laughter. And when that happens, the silence will not return. It will spread beyond the hall, beyond the parish, into every table, every meal, every prayer. The frame lingers on a locked gate, iron rusted through, paint flaked to bone. Beyond it, the silhouette of a building slumped against the horizon. The orphanage, windows dark, roof sagging, walls buckled from rain and time. And yet, despite the ruin, there was always a sense of presence inside, something waiting. The chapel sat at its heart, hidden within the orphanage walls, a room few had seen in its living days, and fewer dared to enter after its doors were sealed. Local children grew up with warnings. Do not touch the gate. Do not speak near the walls. Do not look too long at the windows. But still, the story spread. Urban explorers came. Teenagers with cameras. Men with flashlights. Couples daring each other to spend a night inside. Most never made it past the threshold. But those who did told stories that never left them. The corridors smelled of mildew and damp wood. The wallpaper curled like burnt paper. Floors sagged under each step. And yet, in the center of that ruin, the chapel looked untouched. Its doors bowed inward, but still locked. Its stained glass cracked, yet faintly colored light still filtered through. And those who forced their way inside said the air was different there. Not dust, not decay, but warmth, as though the room still lived. And that was when they saw it. The tables, long wooden, stretched end to end, each set with plates. 72, not 71, not 73, always 72. Forks aligned, knives angled the same, cups placed above the plates with careful symmetry. But something wasn't right. There was no dust on them, no mold, no insects. The rest of the building had rotted, but here, the table remained pristine. One explorer described the sound of glass as though something had just been poured. He swore the goblet before him filled, though his flashlight showed nothing there. Another claimed to hear movement in the corners of the chapel, small steps, feet shifting, the low murmur of voices, and then the whisper, a child's voice, soft, clear, saying grace. One plate, then another, until dozens of voices layered into a chorus. But not one of the explorers stayed past midnight. They all fled. Each claimed the air changed. It grew colder, heavier, as though the room itself was breathing. And when they played back their recordings, the whispers were still there. Children, praying, pausing, then laughing, but not with joy, with repetition. The same laugh, over and over again. One man, who had entered with 2 friends, never spoke of it again. He left the group days later, sold his camera, and refused to return to the city. When asked why, he only said, "I don't think they were praying for themselves." And then he stopped. Others tried to document what they found. Footage exists scattered across the internet. Shaky hands, beams of light scanning the room, voices whispering, "Do you hear that?" But no one remains inside long enough to capture what happens after. Because the moment the chapel clock strikes 12, they leave, every single one. Some run, some stumble, some leave their equipment behind, but none stay. The hall beyond midnight is empty. The doors close again, the windows return to dark, and the building sleeps once more. But always the table waits. Always the plates remain. And those who dare to count counted carefully. 72. Never more, never less. And that is what unsettles the villagers most. Not the whispers, not the laughter, not the presence of a meal laid out in a building long abandoned, but the precision, the impossibility of decay, the way the room defied time itself. And some wonder if the chapel was ever truly abandoned at all. Because they say, if you stand by the fence on the night the explorers go in, you can see the glow of candlelight behind the windows, even when no one has lit them, even when the doors remain locked, even when the chapel is silent. The light still burns, and the table still waits. The frame drifts inward, a hollow nave, a roof collapsing above. The orphanage chapel stands in silence, sealed from the world. Dust hangs unmoving in the air, caught in shafts of light that no longer belong, and yet the silence feels staged, as if beneath the quiet, something waits, something listening. For generations, those who live nearby have carried the same question, a question too disturbing to voice aloud. Were the 72 lost children consumed in some act of devotion, or were they called into service? Because the stories do not end with their disappearance. They change. Each account circles back to the same idea, that the mass inside the chapel never concluded, that it continues, still, an unbroken liturgy echoing beneath locked doors. And though no one has seen it, some insist they have felt it, a vibration underfoot when walking near the walls, a cadence in the air, soft, rhythmic, as though words were being spoken beyond reach. But something wasn't right. When explorers captured recordings inside the chapel, the whispers were always fractured. A single voice here, a dozen overlapping there, but never silence, never an ending. The meal remained laid out, the chairs pulled close, the table fixed in ritual alignment, as though frozen in the moment before communion. One priest, who visited in the early 1970s before the building was condemned, left a single note in his diary. The Mass is unfinished. They are waiting for the final word. And when he died years later, his family found that line circled in his journal again and again, waiting. The weight of that word clung to him. Others described the sensation differently. A teacher from the village said that walking past the chapel gates felt like passing a mouth that could not close. Hungry, breathing, always hungry. And that is what unsettles researchers the most. The building does not rot like others its age. It resists collapse. The chapel's table, the plates, the cutlery, they remain as though cared for, as though maintained, though no one enters. And every year on the same date, villagers claim they hear the bell, not the outer bell tower. It has long since fallen into ruin, but a smaller one inside, a handbell, ringing once, and then silence, as if calling the congregation back to their seats. But there is no congregation left. Not anymore. One explorer, who stayed longer than most, claimed that after the bell faded he heard the scrape of chairs, with dragging over stone, one after another. He left before midnight. He swore he would not stay to hear what followed. And when asked why, his answer was simple. I didn't want to know what they were rising for. Others are not convinced the children were lost at all. They argue the voices are not echoes of the past, but present, that the Mass is not ended, that the 72 were taken not in death, but in duty, bound to the service, bound to continue the prayers, not as themselves, but as something sustained. And if that were true, then what were they sustaining? Because the Mass is not for them. It is not for the living. It is not even for the church. Each account lingers on the same chilling detail. The voices do not speak words of devotion alone. They speak in tones of offering, as though what they keep alive is not God, but something else entirely. And the fear that follows is the thought that what the chapel feeds does not sleep between years. It waits, starved, until the table is filled again. And perhaps this is why the stories never die. Why the villagers lock their doors each year when the bell is rumored to toll. Why no one lingers by the gate after dark. Because they believe the orphanage hungers. And when it does, it counts. 72. Every time. Always 72. One folklorist who cataloged the legends of the region ended her notes with a single chilling line. The Mass never ended. And when the priest lifts the chalice again, we will know what it was for. No one is asked what happens if the chairs remain empty, if the voices falter, if the table is not set. But some fear the answer is worse than the questions, because hunger always returns. And when it does, something must answer it. The children's voices have carried it this long. But what if 1 year they are not enough? The camera lingers again on the chapel door. Still locked, still sealed. But no lock lasts forever, and no ritual hold without end. Somewhere inside, 72 voices whisper their lines. Prayers stretched across decades, feeding something unseen. And each year, the bell calls again. Once, only once, but always enough to remind those listening that the Mass is not over, that it never ended, and that it will not end until something finally rises to take its place. The Mass is eternal because silence protects it. 72 voices serve as its choir, unseen, unending. The reflection leaves a warning. When faith becomes hunger, it consumes the innocent first.